Hey, everybody, welcome back to Eggs. Our guest this week is Scott Ringlein. Scott is founder and CEO of the Energy Alliance Group of North America, or EAG for short. EAG is a green energy solution and cost recovery company that provides energy-saving products, technologies, and services for commercial, industrial, multifamily, and nonprofit buildings, in addition to providing many energy solutions for agricultural applications. Here to talk to us about the state of the industry and so much more, join me in welcoming Scott Ringlein. Hey, Scott.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem.
Of course, yeah. Thanks for making the time. So cool. All right, so let's just get right into this thing, Scott. Let's talk a little bit about who you are and where you come from.
Yeah, so born and bred in Michigan. I'm a true Michigander, and I actually grew up in a small community called Frankenmuth, which anyone from Michigan knows the town. It's Christmas year-round there, but grew up, it's really a farming community, kind of grew up as a farmer, and which kind of, in essence, led me into eventually engineering.
Nice.
Okay. So how did that transition work? So in farming, I mean, seems agricultural. How do you end up an engineer?
So I was always a tinkerer, loved to take things apart, put them back together. And the first co-op I had was with a small engineering firm, actually based in Frankenmuth. They made CNC tooling, and that's really kind of where it got started. I took a lot of architectural classes, design classes, a lot of shop classes where we got to make things. Had a knack for it, and that's what led me to engineering, not only as an undergrad degree, but also as a master's degree.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Well, and I have here on my notes that then you transitioned into automotive. So I feel like you're kind of all over the place. How's that happen?
So growing up, I was a car guy. I still have my 1971 Camaro.
Oh, wow.
Been in storage since, unfortunately, 1986 when I got out of undergrad, put it in storage. It's sat ever since. But growing up, that's what we did. We tinkered with cars. My dad, he actually raced cars, drag raced when he was younger, and when he got married, he kind of got out of that. But always had a passion for cars, and quite honestly, so in '86 when I was applying for jobs, I wasn't necessarily looking to get into automotive. But the first and only job offer I got was in automotive, but it was an awesome experience. I worked for a very small company called Batten Heads and Batten Engineering, and they were contracted to build an engine for a car called the Aerotech, which A.J. Foyt drove. And he set the closed core speed record with this car. And the main purpose behind it was the launching of the Oldsmobile Quad 4 engine line that they used throughout their vehicles. So my first 3 years, that's what I did. I built engines and built parts for engines, and it was a lot of fun.
That's awesome. I feel like that's a very Michigan story, though, that you get into automotive and all this stuff. So at some point, your career took a turn and you got into energy. So, I mean, I feel like we're getting even further apart from the old boy on the farm.
Yeah. So, I stuck with automotive after a short stint at Batten. I worked for Ford for several years, got my master's degree in manufacturing engineering, and then decided to go to the tier 1 level and worked for Walker Exhaust, which was eventually purchased by Tenneco Automotive. And my responsibility, I was a chief engineer, and we designed exhaust systems for Nissan. So from the manifold all the way back to the tailpipe. And because Nissan is based in Asia, that's where I spent most of my career. So the last 13 years, I basically spent on a plane. I had team members in Europe, Asia and South America. So I'm a million mile flyer, and
nice.
that's what I did. But on a Monday morning in 2008, during the crash of the automotive industry, I went into work and was quickly driven home. And that was my last day in automotive. Myself, along with literally tens of thousands of other engineers, over a 2-year period, basically lost their jobs, and that's what happened to me. And so that's how I started and ended automotive. And I'm an optimist by trade, and I actually hired a coach to kind of determine, okay, what's my skill sets? How can I use it to make a dollar? Got an office at a place in Ann Arbor, Michigan, called Spark, which was an incubator at the time for startups.
Interesting.
And started my first company. And I first started out in the business planning industry, working with entrepreneurs and startups on their business plan. But during that process, I got offered an opportunity to be a technical advisor to the Department of Energy and work for the Obama administration on the American Recovery Act.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that was by far probably the greatest work experience I ever had. It was a lot of fun, gave me a completely different perspective on the government and those that are working in DC outside of the White House. And that was really the first time I really had an opportunity to look at a lot of different technologies, and a lot of them were in the what we'll call efficiency, conservation, renewable energy side. That was my first exposure to it. After that finished up, a chance meeting with a gentleman that talked about funding mechanisms for efficiency, conservation, renewable energy measures. And that was my aha moment. Went home and basically came up with a company name, Energy Alliance Group, wrote a business plan. That was in 2012, and we've been doing it ever since. And it's been fun. It's been just a really, really exciting time.
Can you kind of break down EAG for us? What do you guys specialize in? Is it wind, solar, all of the above?
Yeah, all of the above. So my aha moment was the reason why most companies or businesses aren't doing these types of projects. So, we focus on energy efficiency, water conservation, renewable energy, and then what we call environmental protection, which is, for earthquakes, hurricanes, and floods. And statistically, about 98% of the projects in that sector go unfunded. And it's typically because they can't access capital, or it doesn't meet some type of rate of return that they have, or they can't get the funding terms that they need, or they're just not willing to change the way they do things today. And so the thing that we got introduced to was more on the financial side and the financial tools that are out there that can overcome those barriers and actually make it happen. And the primary one that we use is called Property Assessed Clean Energy, which is a funding program now available throughout the U.S., but it's specific for those categories of improvements on buildings. And that's really what's different about us than others, is rather than always looking at the technical solution first, we look at the financial solution, because everybody uses the same tools, whether it's technology, incentives, tax strategies, or the financial side. We all have to use the same tools. It's the process in which they're used and how they focus on it up front during that process. And that's been our success.
So are you focusing more on commercial real estate or commercial properties versus residential, or whoever wants to switch?
Yeah, so a great question. So on the residential side, we stay away from single family just because the options out there are limited still. There's some programs that are being rolling out on bill financing and PACE for residential, but pretty much everything we do is industrial commercial. But multifamily is something that we look at, including nonprofits and some of those other industries that don't fit into single family residential.
Okay. Well, so I wonder, can you walk us a little bit through the process? One of the projects that I read about was that you had done some work with the Detroit stamping plant that was sort of famous from the movie 8 Mile. And so can you maybe talk about what that process is like? So, I mean, maybe just to make it more clear why one might go down this route. I mean, I think there's the sort of, do good for the world side. Yep. But then, the other side is this financial incentive or motivation, make things cheaper, save the business money. And I think you cited you'd save that company nearly 60% in operational costs. So I wonder if you could sort of talk about this process just so that we can sort of understand how it begins and then what the upside is.
Yeah. So, typically most companies, the first thing that they're focused on is either doing an audit to figure out what's wrong, which typically they already know they're inefficient, or they're focusing on the technical solution. All right, hey, if we do this, we're going to save lots of money. Then they go and try and find the money to fund it or make it work within the constraints of whatever the financial constraints are of the company. We do it completely opposite. The first thing that we do is we work with a company to determine what funding source that's out there will meet their needs, irregardless of the technical solution, because, for the most part, the technical solution has always been around. It's always been the money. How do we do it? Not what are we going to do? And so when we focus on the financial side of the transaction first, now we've identified the way to fund it, and now we have a budget that we can set and fit a technical solution to the budget that's available and knowing that we can meet it. I'd mentioned PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy. What is unique about that versus other funding mechanisms out there is that it's structured so that it takes all the risk off of the building owner. It provides a long-term financing period so we can get funding 25, 30 years, which now allows us to look at a much broader variety of the technical solution. And it's set up so that the reduction in utilities and the reduction of maintenance cost cover 100% of the cost of money.
So it literally offsets itself. So
100%.
Make the investment. Usually your returns will cover the cost of the investment over the span of 20, 30 years. That's exactly
it. Yep. And that's been the challenge in industry today is that, one, it's very difficult to get long-term funding for, say you want to replace a roof or you want to do a $5 million upgrade of controls or HVAC. You're lucky, even solar, you're lucky to get maybe a 10 or a 15-year term fixed rate. So most of the companies out there, I think the statistic is 95% of companies require some type of payback within the first 7 years. And then it's like 92% require 5 and like 90% 3. So when you look at those constraints, nobody's doing solar, nobody's doing major overhaul of commercial buildings to implement, building management systems or controls. Nobody's doing windows. We're walking into buildings that were built, in the early 1900s, they still have the existing infrastructure, that same boiler, the same roof, the same windows.
We're in a building right now that was kind of built in that time frame, and the heating and the AC is horrible. It just goes. We don't have any control of the, independent areas. It's just on or off. And it just seems to be very inefficient. There's probably a much better way to do it, but I'm sure that the overhaul process is just a nightmare.
That's right. And it's expensive. It's a huge capital investment when you look at a complete change to the building's infrastructure, because that's what it is. It's really the heart and soul of the building on how it operates. And so when you look at that, the building owner, they're trying to keep their costs down, and they have targets set for their, return on investment. It's always cheaper to put a Band-Aid on it than to go into full surgery. So that's the choice they make.
Yeah, but at some point they're going to have to go into full surgery. It's just a matter of when.
That's right.
So one of the questions I have for you is, the tech that you're investing in, is it going to be obsolete in 5 years? Is it going to be solar? There's a storage problem that comes into play, like the batteries. Do they need to be replaced every 5 years? I haven't done enough research to know enough about it to know, the actual process. Say you were coming into a commercial building like this and you were going to do an overhaul. Would it be solar? Would it be wind? Would it be a combination of everything? And then how can you rely on the equipment for the 30 years that it takes to recoup?
Another great question. So first thing that when we do assess a building like that, we have a lot of clients that say, hey, I want solar. And then we go in their building and it's like, oh, well, you have 1,000-watt metal halide lights. Maybe we should fix that first before we start producing energy, because if you fix that first, now the solar and the storage that you need from a scale standpoint is going to be a lot smaller. The investment's going to be smaller. So that's the first thing that we look at. The other thing is that in a typical capital transaction, nobody pays attention to the expense after they launch it. So I'm going to go out and get a bunch of money. I want to keep it cheap, which in the end costs you more because you're going to have a higher maintenance cost typically. And so what happens is they make the investment and then it costs them a fortune to maintain it. And the approach we take is we're looking at what we call life cycle costs. So you asked about, well, what about replacement? All right. If you do the financial model properly and you look at, all right, in 10 years, we're going to have to replace the inverters on a solar system, or 10 or 15 years, the batteries are going to have to be changed out. We look at those costs because that's really the true cost of the capital investment. And most capital programs and most companies, they don't look at that. Whereas a program like PACE looks at all cost included in this type of investment. So we're looking at, all right, what is the maintenance? What are the replacement costs? And is there some type of maintenance program over that long period of time? And because the way PACE is structured, it allows the company and the investor and the developer to physically look at all costs associated with it so that down the road, if there is a replacement required, it can happen. The other question you had, Mike, was on, well, what happens if it gets outdated? So here's another beauty of PACE, is that PACE is based on the value of the building. And even if you have a mortgage on it, over time, that value is going to increase and your debt is going to go down. Well, when you increase that window, now you have access to more funding to what? Implement something that's going to be more efficient than what you have today. So it doesn't matter whether it's lighting, HVAC, solar. Yes, there's going to be a new product out there that's going to be more efficient. what we do is we look at, okay, can we take that improved efficiency and reduction in maintenance and offset this other cost that you're going to incur to install it? And so you're really stacking them on top of each other. And with PACE, you're really looking at the building as part of infrastructure, because it should be there forever, rather than short term. And most of the time, the approach with capital is very short term. All right, I want a quick payback, get it off the books, because I don't know what I'm going to do in 5 years. And if I have to sell it, I don't want to carry that debt. PACE actually secures the debt on the property rather than on whoever owns it or the company. So now if you sell, it's treated as a property tax assessment. It transfers with the building, not the building owner. So now you've mitigated their risk. They're not carrying that debt. It's really an expense to them because it's a tax. But that's how we're able to secure long-term funding, because it's treated as a property tax assessment rather than just debt.
Okay. So can you elaborate a little bit on this funding? So we're talking about this PACE program. And I mean, are these like federal loans? Are they private? Or like, I mean, I think for the average consumer, you know, there's a lot of stuff going around right now. The, you know, kickbacks from the government if you install solar, and, you know, you get a few bucks off your utility bill if you put in a little extra insulation or whatever it is. I mean, there's a lot of these like incentive programs for consumers, but at the larger, more commercial level, like when you are putting in, you know, systems that are, you know, I guess in some cases millions of dollars, where is this money coming from? Like, are these through incentive programs, or is it actual hard money that you're borrowing from somebody,
private
or
lenders
combinations
with a percentage return kind of thing, or yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah. So first and foremost, it's actually an active legislation at the state level. So it's not a federal program, it's state-based. But that's really where the public sector and the private sector kind of come together. The funding is all coming through private funding. So these are equity investors that are managing 401ks, pension funds, life insurance, and stuff like that. They're looking for something that's very secure, nice rate of return, but a long term, and comes without a lot of risk. So PACE itself, it was developed in 2008, 2009 in California. It was a tool that was implemented to deploy solar. And originally it was deploy solar on single family homes, and then it quickly morphed into the industrial commercial sector. But the mechanism that is used is old. It uses property tax assessments to secure funding. And we've been using property tax assessments since Ben Franklin days in the mid 1700s to put in roads, to repair sewers and water. So what happens is you know, say you got a community, they have to put in a new water line. They place a property tax assessment on each one of the buildings that's going to benefit from it. And then whoever owns that property, they continue to pay that assessment. And if you default, well, then whoever buys the property, they're just paying back the back taxes, not the total debt through the assessment. PACE does the same thing. So they look at the building as infrastructure. You're the owner. You say, I want to take on a property tax assessment to make my building better. And every state that has this legislation, it is implemented down at the taxing authority. So it could be a township, a city, a county. You know, they're the ones that actually put the assessment on. It allows a building owner to get access to 20 to 25% of the value of the building, and it's secured by the property itself, not the owner. So there's no personal guarantee, it's non-recourse, and the monies cover 100% of the cost. So there's no down payment, there's no like 80-20, 70-30 split. It's long-term and fixed rate. So typically it's 10-year treasury plus so many percentage points. But we can secure funding for 20, 25 years. And as I mentioned before, it's paid through the reduction of utilities and maintenance costs. So a lot of times clients will say, well, we don't have the money to pay for this. Well, you do, because you're paying it today. You're paying it in your utilities and you're paying it in your maintenance cost for the technologies you have today. What we're going to do is we're going to take that savings on both sides of the equations and apply it to implementing these types of improvements. And so when you do that, and you include the incentives, tax credits, everything else that comes with these improvements, now you can achieve a return on investment in year one rather than waiting 5 or 10 or 15 years. And because it's a tax on the company's balance sheet, it doesn't show up as debt, it shows up as expense, because tax is an expense. And then when you sell the building, all the improvements, because they're real property, stay with the building. And so they're transferred to the next owner rather than traditional debt. Oh, you have to pay it off before you sell the building. And that's really the game changer, is that they're like looking at the building as infrastructure and using that value rather than the value of the borrower to make these improvements. And
that's awesome.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It is truly a paradigm shift in how these improvements are funded now. And it's new. You know, a lot of people don't know about it, but it's available in 35 states in the US. It's moved into Canada. Europe is starting to implement it. Australia has implemented it. And other countries are starting to look at it as a tool to improve infrastructure as buildings rather than the streets and the water and the sewer and all that.
Yeah, I think what I like about it so much is just how accessible it makes all those things, you know, because I mean, like you said before, I mean, if you just had to go take a loan to add a solar system to your place or whatever, a traditional loan, you just go to the bank and borrow money and you need collateral and et cetera. You know, that might be enough reason to just stick with that Band-Aid solution versus just, you know, biting the bullet and doing the big job.
So, the Energy Alliance group, your company, you specialize in commercial properties and you try to stick away from like the single family residences. Say, for example, I have a piece of property that I want to put solar on, but it's a single family residence. Will the PACE program work with that, or is it specifically for commercial properties?
So in some states it does. And there is a way to find that out. There is a website, pacenation.org. This is a nonprofit based out of Washington, D.C. They track everything that has to do with PACE in the United States. So you can go there, you can select the state you live in, and you can find out, does PACE offer single-family residential, commercial, both, or none? And then once you have that information, now you can look at, okay, who's administering the program within the state, and then who are the contractors that are approved to work with it. So we consider ourselves a developer. So we're technology agnostic. You know, right now we have projects that include solar, LED, combined heat and power, heat recovery, all sorts of stuff. And to be a developer in the PACE kind of industry, you have to be approved by whoever that administrator is within the state. So it's not a carte blanche, you know, anybody can do it because there's certain requirements from the program itself as far as financials and how you calculate the savings. But that resource is the go-to to find these things out. And, you know, the same with your listeners, whether they're single family residential owners or in the commercial industrial sector, that's a great resource to find out, hey, does this program exist where we're at? And it gives you the tools to try and get it implemented where you're at too. You know, not only from the state standpoint, but if you're in a state that has a legislation, but where you live does not, it'll kind of give you the steps to actually get it implemented where you're at so you can use it.
Okay. So is it, I mean, and maybe I'm seeing this the wrong way, but I mean, it seems that these PACE programs probably lean more towards commercial just because of the cost of the scale of putting in all this gear, right? Like there's probably not as much equity in a home or a single family home as there might be in a $50 million building.
Exactly. And there's other things. Of course, a lot of the loans out there on single family residential are backed by federal entities. And when you start to mix federal and state entities together, there's been some pushback. So, like Fannie Mae and Fannie Mac, and that was the reason why California moved away from single family residential at first, because there was concerns about, taking this assessment, putting a lien against a property. And those that carry the senior debt, the first thing that they say is, oh, well, if they default, we're never going to get our money back. Well, property tax, whether it's traditional or an assessment, it always has first position on property. Excuse me, whether single family or industrial commercial. What's unique about it is if you default and somebody purchases the property, they don't have to pay for that principal balance that's remaining on the assessment. So the senior lender is still protected. They still have that first position in regards to the value, and they still have the position against whoever owns it. So remember, with an assessment, it's not on the owner, it's on the building itself. A senior lender is going to go after who?
They're going to go after the owner.
Whoever owned it or whoever provided that personal guarantee. So,
so it's
it mitigates their risk a little bit. Yeah, it mitigates their risk a little bit. But back to your question, Ryan, part of it is what I just explained, and then also having value in a home to be able to do some of these upgrades. HVAC, that might be a $5,000 or a $10,000 improvement, but then when you're getting into, windows, doors, roofs, solar, the expense is higher. And now you have to look at, okay, what's the mortgage on the building today? Because there's restrictions on how much loan to value you can have against a property when you combine a traditional debt and a property tax assessment. And, because of what happened in industry, it's pretty restrictive. That's why we can't borrow 80% of the value of the property. We're restricted to 20 to 30%, depending on whether they have a mortgage, what state it's in, who the borrower is going to be, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so for like the building owner, you were talking that, and this I assume might be a problem with single family home too. But I'm just curious. So like my in-laws just recently had a solar system installed in their house. They've just got maybe 4,000 square feet, not a major property or anything. But I want to say that the total cost of the installation was something like $33,000, something like that.
Yep.
How long, I mean, like, is technology so good that they will actually recoup on that? And is that again where like some of this PACE stuff comes into play, where like in a larger commercial place, the savings can be much grander scale maybe than in a home? So like, if they're saving $200 a month, I mean, it'll take a lifetime to pay off that 32 grand. Where even with some incentives or whatever. But if I had a 100,000 square foot warehouse coated in solar panels, I might be able to save and power that year what it costs to put that in.
Yeah, part of it's going to be scale, but in the end, it's what are they paying for power and what's it going to cost to produce power. So it's based on cost per kilowatt. So a solar system, if it's producing so many kilowatts, and you know what the cost is, here's your cost per kilowatt hour. What are you paying today at the utility? But then when you finance it, now you're adding in that cost of money. And so as you look at, how am I going to fund it? Single family residential, you might get a 10-year loan, possibly 15-year loan. But if you're already paying, say, 13, 15, 20 cents a kilowatt hour and you're putting on a solar, it's going to take you a lot longer to get any type of return than, say, here in the state of Michigan, we have clients that are paying 8 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And so the cheaper the power, the longer it's going to take to pay back. The more expensive, the shorter it's going to take to pay back.
Mm-hmm.
When you get into the industrial commercial side, they're paying different rates than residential. Typically, they're paying a cheaper rate because why? They're buying energy in mass quantities.
Yeah.
However, typically with those companies, especially on the coastal communities, they're paying a fee to use energy during, the hours of, say, noon till 3 p.m. They're getting a huge increase in cost. Yeah. So a lot of times solar is just used to control the peak cost. That's what we call the peak cost, maybe between noon and 4 or 11 and 5 or something like that, where everybody's using their air conditioning and the utilities are strained. So they're going to, in essence, penalize those that are big users during those periods.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you look at solar in that application versus a single family residential that's not typically paying peak cost. It's a lot easier for them to achieve some type of rate of return in a shorter period of time.
Okay.
Now, I've heard, and this is just hearsay, I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard that you can actually generate enough power that it'll cycle back into the system, and they actually could owe you money at the end of the month based on your power consumption.
Yep.
Yeah. Would that be like, say, for example, in his in-laws, for example, if they were able to generate enough power to where it's going back into the system, would that help offset the cost of the loan over because if you're getting a check from the power company every month, I don't know. I don't know what kind of numbers we're talking here. Like, would it be feasible to add a little more solar panels to help pay it off quicker?
Yes, but that depends on the interconnection rules and regulations that are mandated by either the state and the local utility.
So it all comes down to location, really.
That's right. And unfortunately, that model has not progressed to the point where in most applications, we don't count on that. That's one of those, well, yeah, it would be nice, but say here in Michigan, if you're paying, say, 10 cents a kilowatt hour, they're not buying it for 10 cents a kilowatt hour. They're only going to buy it for maybe 5 cents or 3 cents.
Yeah.
Because the 10 cents
reseller, they're kind of upping it, as it goes down the line. They're going, we're going to get our fee and you're going to pay a little more.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and all right, if it's generated at a coal plant on the west side of the state and you're on the east side of the state, the cost includes all the transmission fees, all the infrastructure and all that, where you're just generating power and now you're putting it back into their grid. They still have to pay to transmit it somewhere else.
Oh, true.
And so I wish that I could say, oh my gosh, yeah, that's the way to go. We should all be putting solar on and making money with it. But our first approach is, how can we offset maybe 70% of what you use through these mechanisms and not focus on, hey, producing more than you can use. And then that becomes another issue too, is that in a lot of states, Michigan included, say you're using 100 kilowatts of power and you produce 200. By law, you now become a, quote, utility provider, which is regulated in the state, which you can too, because you're not licensed. So we as a developer, we can't go in and design a system that's going to produce more power than they'll ever use on a daily or yearly basis because of those rules and regulations. That's why you don't see a lot of community solar yet. And you don't see a lot of solar around, especially here in Michigan, because of the rules and the regulations in regards to, interconnection, what you're going to get back, how much you can produce, and then the financial side of it,
Oh, interesting. So, is that just like a technology issue, like that legislation hasn't come around and made that easier for people to do? I mean, obviously, I had a question here. I was curious about just sort of the state of the industry, like where we are in terms of what's efficient and what isn't, and what are the best systems. But I mean, so if the premise is basically you could build a larger solar field and generate more power than you might ever need in your life and resell it back, like, is that a, I mean, the legislation is in place that stops that from happening now, but what is the benefit of that not happening?
Well,
Like,
it's
why isn't
probably
that being
it's
pushed
probably
forward?
an infrastructure problem with the people who are providing the power lines and the wiring and everything, that they've got to get their piece of the action too. And there's probably just a logistical nightmare to try and get it all to work together, is what I assume.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's part of it, but it's really more of a pushback from the utility providers. They're guarding their business. They're in the business
That
of
makes
what?
sense.
Producing electricity. And to go to the quote Wild West model where everybody's going to produce it and try and get a share of that pot. Well, one, big thinking is that, oh, geez, we're producing so much power, we don't have enough use for it all. I mean, if everybody produced solar on their homes or businesses and stuff like that. So, a lot of it has to do with the business itself, the infrastructure, storage, peak loading. There's a lot of moving parts in that power production that you can't just, hey, tomorrow everybody can produce as much as they want, just throw it back on the grid.
Now, if
there
you're
has
not,
to be control.
do you know if you're not tied to like a utility system, for example, say you wanted to build a subdivision that did its own solar power for your own subdivision. You weren't hoping to tie back into another system. You were just going to power these 20 homes on your solar farm. Like, I mean, can you do that kind of thing, or do you still fall into that utility category where you're providing that power, therefore you're the utility?
Yeah. I wish I could say, you can go out and do it, but unfortunately that's not the case. There's because now you're getting into what we call community solar. And again, there's certain rules and regulations in regards to in essence become a power provider. Now with that said, it could be established where, all right, we're going to produce it, we're going to store it, and we're not going to produce any more that's used. I think there's some workarounds there, but it's a challenge. And that's what we're seeing out in industry is that, it's not open arms from the utilities. They still want the control, but we certainly don't see them also taking the steps to offer it to everybody. I look at it, that should be a business model for them. Hey, I want to rent out your roof. I'm going to install solar, produce as much power as I can. We're going to sell it to you at this rate. And then guess what? Any extra, we're going to put back on the grid to lessen the amount we have to produce through other means.
Yeah. Well, see, that would just make sense to me.
Yeah.
It come down, it would almost reminds me of like the cell phone companies leasing out land for the cell phone towers. Same kind of principle almost.
Yep. Every time I fly into a major city and I see all these flat roofs, I'm like, why is there not solar everywhere?
Well, and it seems, it's, I guess, unfortunate, I guess it's the reality, but I mean, so much of that being steered by just sort of the business or sort of, I mean, I don't want it to sound so sinister, but like by lobbyists and people like that versus, the other side of the business or the other side of your business, which is sort of the do good for the earth kind of thing.
Well, there's got to be a fine line in between the two because yes, you need to be able to pay for the business is a part of it, but with everyone, the global warming and everything that's going on, there's going to be a change. There's got to be a change at some point. I mean, what do you see in the next 15 years? Like, what kind of tech are we going to be kind of going towards? Is solar the end all here? Is that the way to go, or are there other technologies? Like I've seen stuff like the little cubes that they make the roads out of that is solar and it also lights and heats and all that stuff. I've seen the wave energy. I've seen all sorts of concepts, but I haven't seen them actually implemented. What do you
Yeah.
see coming down the pipeline?
Yeah. I mean, certainly there's some technologies out there that are paradigm shifts, and they're going to really change the landscape of power production or efficiency. But it's all about scale. If we look at solar and we went back 15 years, it was far more expensive than it is today. And that's all been through what? Scale and driving down cost. It really has not been, oh my gosh, we've come up with a new way to produce solar energy. It's been, hey, we've refined the way we do it, and now we've scaled it. And there's what they call the tipping point, where we're achieving a cost point where it's cheaper to use solar than it is traditional methods of generating electricity. And so, to answer your question, Mike, as far as 15 years, yes, there's going to be some advancements. I would not expect that these are going to be advancements where, okay, I can go to a Lowe's and buy the latest fancy whirligig, put it in my house, and geez, now I don't need any power from anyone else. That typically is not going to happen. What I think we're going to see is that the people with money, so the investors, are finally seeing that, hey, we can invest in these types of technologies and get a return. So programs like PACE in the next 5, 10, 15 years are going to expand not only within the US, but globally. And then we're going to see a lot more focus on taking what we have today, the building stock that we have today, and making it more efficient, and then also improving it from an environmental protection. So today we can use PACE dollars to implement changes to a building for earthquake protection. We can use PACE dollars in Florida to put in better windows for hurricane protection. And so as these opportunities move forward, more people are going to find out about it, and there's going to be a lot more investment in it. And that's what we've seen over the last, probably 5 years, is the amount of money that's being put into these types of improvements. The technology itself hasn't been the leader. LED lighting's been around for a long time, but yet maybe less than 5% of all the commercial industrial buildings have it. And people say, well, geez, why? It's so much more efficient. Money, 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 money. It has really nothing to do with the technology solution. You guys go to a hardware and you see a light bulb that's 98 cents or a light bulb that's $9.80. You're going to buy the 98 cent one. But yet, if you physically take the time to look at the cost and the savings of buying that $9.80 LED light, it far outweighs spending 98 cents. And that's really what we're going through, is just the understanding of, hey, these efficient technologies, yeah, they cost more, but in the long run, you're actually going to get a better rate of return than sticking with the old technology.
Well, they last longer.
Yeah.
I mean, the LED technology, I mean, it's ridiculous that more people aren't using it.
Well, and I guess on a little tiny scale, it's the same thing as this whole PACE discussion we've been having, right? I mean, it's basically the cost of this light bulb versus what it costs to run over time versus the cost of replacement versus traditional.
Yeah.
So it's I mean, I guess it's basically a tiny or micro version of that same argument. Why you might choose LED versus just going traditional.
So, to my understanding, the biggest problem with like solar and self-generated power is the storage, the batteries. Is that true? Is that I mean, it seems to me that would be the biggest hurdle to get by, is where you can put it when you capture it.
Yeah.
And then the infrastructure of getting it wired into your house. I'm sure there's you go into the power box and you just tie it in and you're good. But as a non-electrician here, Is that the biggest hurdle, is the power and then getting it hooked up?
I would say from a scalability, yes. So it's the same thing. They're looking at, okay, what's the cost per kilowatt to store that energy? And it's all about scale and the technology to store it from a size. So if we look at computers, we go back, 20, 30 years ago, and we look at the size of a computer back then versus today, it's the same thing with battery technology. All right, I need a truck size battery to store a bunch of power. Maybe in 15 years, it'll be, I only need a small car size to store that much power. So it's scale. It's really just scale and the cost to actually store it. But in like single family residential, and in a lot of cases with some of the smaller industrial commercial, it still makes sense depending on what are you paying for power, and then are there peak charges. So for instance, if we're going to put solar on, and I'm going to produce solar or power with solar all day long, I also want to look at, can I produce enough solar to put so much of it into battery storage so that the next day when there's a peak load, I'm not using all the energy we're generating off of solar. I'm going to use the energy that's sitting in that battery and do that over and over and over again. And it all comes to financials. And then back to what we originally talked about. Do you have the capital? Does it meet your rate of return? And can you get access to capital that makes sense? That, it is 25 years or 30 years, and it includes a battery replacement program or some type of long-term warranty. And that's the challenge that's in industry. I always, I refer it to a dog chasing after its tail. It's just going around and around in circles until it's broken. And so programs like PACE and a few others out there, they've kind of broken it so that, hey, we can actually do this because now I can get access to capital that makes sense. It's long-term, it mitigates risk, fixed rate, and now I can start looking at these types of improvements that I would never consider before, And battery is going to be one of those things as far as energy storage. When you get to the utility scale, that's where it becomes a greater challenge because of that physical cost and size and infrastructure and all those things that go with the utility scale standpoint.
Yeah, that makes sense. So as we're starting to get to the end of this, can you talk a little bit about just sort of the process? If I'm a business owner, maybe I've got a small building, nothing crazy, or I don't know, maybe you've got something bigger, a multi-tenant kind of commercial building, but I'm interested in this stuff. I've never thought of it before today. I heard this podcast and now I'm crazed to learn more about it. Is this where they engage with a company like yours, or do they talk to these program managers and, state by state, or like how would one start the process to start going down this road? Because it sounds like there's a lot of problem solving involved in this, and making it work. You've got to do not only all these calculations and studies to assess, what it's actually going to cost versus the cost of the building and so on, but like where would one start if they wanted to start going down that road?
Yeah, so two places that we always recommend. One is the PACE Nation, because then they can look at a very specific type of program to do the improvements that they want to do. And then there's also another website. It's called Desire, but it's not DESIRE. It's actually, I think it's DSIR and possibly E. But that's like a federal website that you can go by state and learn about all the different funding and incentive programs for doing these types of projects. So that's the first thing that you can do from an education standpoint to even find it out.
I think the website is DSIREUSA.org.
Yep. Very good. Yeah. Yep. That's it, Mike. And so that's a great place to start to even find out, geez, in my area, what exists? Because unfortunately, there's some states out there that there's literally no incentive to do it, nor are there these types of funding mechanisms to do it. And then, additionally, certainly they can contact, a company like ourselves that are in this industry. And, whether we can do the project, we're always open to educating those that want to, or hooking them up with those that can help them pursue this. We've been in this industry now for 7 years, so we know the programs that are out there very well, and we have a good working relationship with a lot of the administrators and the funders that we can put them in touch with and start their process.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think really good information. I think those would be great resources for people to see if they, like you mentioned, if they can even, go for some of this stuff. I mean, there is this, philanthropic piece where people want to do good for the world, or they want to do better on energy consumption and things like that. I think there are a lot of, bleeding hearts out there that are trying to do better.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, obviously there's also this business aspect, especially if you're doing it in a commercial space or whatever, where it has to kind of make sense. So I think those are great places to start.
Yeah.
Well, cool.
Yeah.
So Scott, any last parting shots, or where can people find out more?
Yeah, so they can certainly go to our website. It's energyalliancegroup.org, or if they want to go straight to our contact page, they could just type into their browser what's possible.today, and that'll take them, right to our contact page. But, parting comments is really education. Get knowledgeable with what's out there, and then don't take the position that, we can't do it, we can't afford to do it. Right now there is more money and more programs out there to do these types of improvements. What's lacking is just the knowledge of them to actually move forward. And so a lot of what we do is education based, like podcast. I speak at conferences all over the US, and this is what we talk about, is how you can do it rather than the reasons why you can't.
Sort of navigating all this stuff.
Yeah. Yep.
So cool. Well, that makes perfect sense. Well, great. So thanks so much again. Our guest was Scott Ringlein. Really appreciate your time today and this conversation. It was really interesting. I was excited to learn about some of this stuff.
Yeah,
so thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Mike and Ryan. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, appreciate you making the time for us.